Thank you. Great. The
Thank
floor
you very
is
much, and I would like to appreciate. I do appreciate putting Marta's Mosca's presentation, scholarly presentation, before mine, because that makes my presentation, puts my presentation then into a perspective. Thank you, Marta, for the wonderful presentation. So, do I control it from here? I'd like to switch to the next slide.
with the arrows, left, left, right.
Yeah, I'm trying. It doesn't work.
Okay, it works. It's
okay. This is a potpourri of the things that we'll be discussing this morning. I will update you on evolving concepts and on things that have changed over the last 5 years regarding lupus epidemiology and causes. I'll talk a little bit about the phenotype of the disease and some issues of the diagnosis of the disease, and discuss also the metrology and a few things about the outcome measures and the problems that we had with these outcome measures in doing the lupus trials. Then I will switch to the management of lupus, and I will give you the basic philosophy besides the recent update of the EULAR recommendations for lupus. And I will discuss a few things about women's health. And finally, I will tell you where we stand and where we're going. I will review some recent clinical trials and what we have learned from them, and also some new targets that they are emerging. The thing is, the older I grow, the more I appreciate that in order to put the disease, the work that has been done in lupus into a context, you need to go back to the history of the disease. It's a fascinating history. Let me review it with 2 slides for you. Most people agree that Hippocrates may have described the first case of lupus when he described a disfiguring rash in women in the spring. In his book about the seasonal diseases, the disease of the spring, he has described probably the first case for lupus. Then it came an archbishop of Tours who used the term lupus for this disfiguring disease. And then a Hungarian pathologist, Kaposi, subdivided lupus into discoid and systemic, introducing the concept of systemic disease and also recognizing the potentially fatal outcome of the disease. So Kaposi moves the lupus into the internist area and from the dermatology. After the Second World War II, the lupus cells were described in bone marrow aspirates from lupus patients who had cytopenias, and they were seeing this engulfed apoptotic material by macrophages in the bone marrow. That was done in the Mayo Clinic in 1948. The familial aggregation of lupus described by Leonard, Arnett, and Schulman at Johns Hopkins. There also was Mary Betty Stevens, who was very instrumental in describing the phenotype of the disease. I think one of the most important discoveries for lupus was the recognition that lupus does not have a typical disease pattern, and that you have to, as Marta has already alluded, you have to consider the overall picture of the disease, what is happening now, but also what has happened in the past, and taking everything into consideration. And there was the late Du Bois in California. You may have heard about the Du Bois, the classical textbook for lupus, and he was a very good clinician, and he helped us recognize this unique feature of lupus. The animal models of lupus, the NZB black white, was discovered in New Zealand at the Otago Medical School. It was a very important tool to have a spontaneous model of lupus. Then in Cleveland in 1954, they discovered the drug-induced lupus with the hydralazine. They had the cardiology clinic, and they were getting a lot of cases of pericarditis and drug-induced lupus. The American College of Rheumatology created the first classification criteria in 1982, and then they were updated to include the anticardiolipin antibodies. In terms of the treatment, the major, I guess what changed dramatically the course of lupus was the introduction of the steroids by the Mayo Clinic physicians, and also the use of cytotoxic drugs to limit the amount of the steroids that you use for the disease. There was a paper in Canada on cyclophosphamide, but it was really the NIH, Fred Steinberg, Jim Bello, and John Decker that pioneered all these trials. And this is the group that I had I was blessed to join and continue their work. And finally, after a long period of frustrating battles to discover new diseases, new therapies, the first clinical trial of lupus with biologics, Benlysta, was approved, and that is creating a history of its own, the history of targeted therapy in lupus. What causes lupus? We agree that genes and environments have to interact, and this combination results in impaired clearance of certain nucleic acids that circulate and they stimulate the production of interferon alpha, which initiates a lot of aberrant immune responses. That creates the persistence of self-directed immune responses, autoreactivity in terms of autoantibodies and T cells, and these autoantibodies and immune complexes may damage the tissue. A few things that have evolved just to delineate further the pathogenesis of lupus is that we knew about the UV light and controlling the pathogenesis, but there are good studies now suggesting that smoking, an environmental factor, smoking can interact with the genetic background and increase the likelihood, like in rheumatoid arthritis, to develop lupus. And of interest, among all lupus autoantibodies that have been studied in smokers, only the anticardiolipin antibodies have been correlated with them. The list of drugs that induce lupus includes now over 118 drugs, and the new additions are the most important new additions are the TNF agents. In terms of genetic background, we recognize now a polygenic additive form of genetic background and familial aggregation. And there it came a very interesting study from Taiwan, it's a nationwide and has important implications in counseling these patients. In this study, the odds ratio to develop lupus is 315 for twins of lupus patients. The risk is 24 increased for the brothers and sisters of these patients, especially for the sisters. 10-fold increase in the risk for the parents, and importantly, for the kids of the lupus patients, it's almost 15-fold increased risk to develop lupus. The concordance of lupus in monozygotic twins is around 25%. Initially, we thought that genetic susceptibility to lupus accounted only for 25% based on the figure above. But now, with the new genetic studies, the genetic contribution in lupus is almost 50%, and the other 50% is environmental factors. Some of them shared within the family, and some of them are unique for the individual at risk. Another important piece of information which correlates with the clinical observations. If a relative of first degree has lupus, then there is a 5-fold increase in the risk that a person in the family will develop Sjogren's, 5-fold risk for systemic sclerosis. And this is why these diseases are called connective tissue diseases and belong in the same family, pretty much. And you can see the risks For myositis, the risk is lower, and for rheumatoid arthritis, even lower. And finally, now we understand why in families you have aggregation of lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and Sjögren's syndrome. And there are whole exome sequencing studies, a report published in Arthritis and Rheumatism last year, including 31 families with autoimmune rheumatic diseases, and they discovered the reason, what accounts for the familial aggregation in the same family of all these diseases are T-cell genetic variations in the T-cell receptor signaling pathway, and this accounts for this segregation of diseases and autoimmune diseases. Let me go over the history of the disease. Lupus is a war, it's not a battle. It's a lifelong disease, especially when it starts in a young age. And it is important, like the neurologists have done in multiple sclerosis, to delineate the natural history of the disease. And there is preclinical phase of the disease, well characterized, and then there's a clinical phase with exacerbations, with the peaks denote flares of the disease. With the flares, you accumulate damage, which is shown with the red, and if you don't treat the disease, then you accumulate damage. And the new concept that has evolved, like in many rheumatic diseases, is that if you treat effectively inflammation, you decrease the flares of the disease, so you have less peaks in the lower part of the panel, but also you do have less damage, as shown in the slide. A few more things about the prevalence of disease and the clinical picture of the disease, the epidemiology of disease. What we see in the textbooks probably is wrong because it used to originate from major referral centers that did not reflect the accurate picture in the community. I will cite here two cohorts, one from Crete with almost 900 patients. This is community-based, includes primary and secondary and tertiary care. And there are other one from Atiko, where I work now, with almost 800 patients, secondary, tertiary care. If you take in the community, as you see, the typical person who gets lupus is a middle-aged woman. And, but also you see that you do see lupus as later in life. But this is the typical, and in a community-based cohort, 50% of the lupus cases are mild, which is good news. So lupus is not always bad. And this is the picture that you get in the community. If you go, though, and if you follow later these patients, if you go to big centers like ours, you'll see that from these mild cases, 50%, almost half of them will progress to moderate to mild disease. So overall, although in most of the lupus in the community it's mild, with time, 1/3 of the patients will have mild disease, 1/3 will have moderate disease, and 1/3 will have severe disease. The clinical course also is very important because there are many important studies from Doria and Jurovich and Michel Petri in different parts of the world studying the clinical course of the disease. Most studies suggest that 70% of lupus patients have a remitting and relapsing course of the disease. 15% of them, they reach prolonged remission, whereas another 15% they have continuous disease activity. Andrea Doria gives higher rates of remission that may have to do with methodological issues and the difference in the cohorts. But so lupus is not a single, like in multiple sclerosis, where you have 4 multiple phenotypes. In lupus, you can distinguish clearly these 3 phenotypes in the clinical course, with most patients having a remitting and relapsing course. And only 30% have prolonged remission, 15%. That has been our experience too. So let's move a little bit into the clinical presentation. I don't know whether you remember this beautiful BBC series about the veterinarian, all animals, great and small. And that's where I borrow this title. Lupus phenotype is great and small, important and less important, life-threatening and non-life-threatening. And let's discuss a few things about the phenotype of lupus. With this slide, which summarizes the key features and organs involved in lupus, this is based on our cohorts in Athens and in Crete. I would like to draw your attention to two things. The thing that Martha also alluded, that fever is a common feature of lupus. And finally, we came to appreciate and include it in the criteria. But there is another 20% of the non-criteria organ involvement that people do not include in the classification criteria. 20% of the patients have such manifestations, and I'll get back to this. Also to tell you, to indicate that in contrast to what I was seeing at NIH, that 70% of the lupus patients had nephritis, when I went to Crete, only 20% of the lupus patients developed significant renal disease. And this is the referral bias. And also to highlight that in childhood lupus, kids tend to have more fever, tend to have more neurological disease, and tend to have more renal disease. In a single word, childhood onset lupus is more aggressive and has more fever. Diagnosis and the confusion with classification versus diagnosis. I don't have to discuss this because Martha did a scholarly review of these issues and the important, but I'll get back to some of them and the points that she discussed, and I'll try to offer you practical advice not to classify lupus. I don't care about classification if I don't do research, but to diagnose lupus, and I will try to leave you with some practical messages from recent work that we have done with George Bertschias. Just to remind you that there are some unwise choices. There are wise choices and there are unwise choices in lupus. Unwise choices. We do not repeat ANA if it's positive once. We don't repeat the serology, DNA antibodies and anti-DNA in patients with steadily improving or inactive disease. It's a waste of money. And finally, it's a big mistake to omit urinalysis from routine laboratory check. If I have lupus patients, I will spend my money in doing urinalysis instead of doing serology. Now, Martha talked about the classification criteria that allows us to classify earlier the disease, and this is wonderful because we can include more patients. But what do you do? And she talked about the SLEEK criteria, and also she talked about the new SCR and the EULAR criteria, where she played a very important role with Martin Arringer. But one of the major limitations of the new criteria is that you require a patient that to have ANA positive. For classification, I can live with this. For diagnosis, I cannot live with this. I think that needs to be corrected. So this was addressed by this paper by Christina Damichou from Crete that George Bertschias did. And they offer practical advice what to do with the patients who test ANA negative. In these patients, they say that in order to make the diagnosis of lupus, you have to take into consideration complement and in order to make you help you go to make the diagnosis. I was not satisfied with this because I have been talking for many years about the need to develop diagnostic criteria. And I proposed that to EULAR, and they were concerned about the legal limitations. But in multiple sclerosis, you do have diagnostic criteria. And I pushed more George Bertschias and his team. And George, in a paper that has been submitted to the Annals of Rheumatic Disease, now we're talking about diagnostic criteria. They came up with this simple scoring system with these features that similar to the classification criteria, they are scored. Thrombocytopenia takes a score of 4.5. To get lupus, you need a score of at least 7. And to make it easier, I pushed further George, and he talked with the artificial intelligence people at the Crete, at the Polytechnic School in Crete, and they created this wonderful tool. And you'll see this side. This, of course, needs to be validated. This paper has been submitted, but you can find this tool on site. So it's like in other diseases. This SLE diagnostic index, that's how George Beskas calls it, gives you the opportunity to estimate the probability of lupus. When you make the diagnosis of lupus, you're not 100% sure. So that gives you percent. For example, let's take an example. If I have malar rash, arthritis, olar ulcers, and leukopenia, that gives you 60% probability. This is likely the diagnosis of lupus. Eventually, the patient may develop more manifestations, and you are more firm about the diagnosis. But the interesting points are here. If you add serositis to this, then there is 90% probability that this is lupus. You do not need the serology there, and that's very important. If you add thrombocytopenia, 99% without DNA. If you add to the above, to the case 1, DNA goes to 90%. If you replace DNA with low C3 or anti-DNA, again, so that tells you that you can use for diagnostic purposes interchangeably serology for diagnosis, not for the classification. And the same applies for the serology with the second paradigm. I would like to show you how important is serology in the diagnosis of lupus. I will skip it. Now, another thing that has been clear in lupus is that the coexistence of variable endotypes. Marta made the comment that you may have multiple endotypes of the disease. The antiphospholipid syndrome is an endotype, a subgroup of lupus patients. The lupus is Marta has done wonderful work there, is another endotype of lupus. The renal dominant disease, if you look at the nephrology offices, they are predominantly renal dominant disease. You don't see the other features that we see. There is a blood dominant disease. A lot of hematologists follow ITP or hemolytic anemia patients that have lupus, and they discovered it 5 or 10 years later. And another endotype is the Sjogren's syndrome. Few things about some phenotypes, interesting phenotypes in lupus. In terms of thrombotic thrombocytotic purpura, most experts agree that TTP and lupus are distinct clinical syndromes and only rarely coexist. The macrophage activation syndrome in lupus and in other diseases after stills has received increased attention in lupus, and it's important to keep it in mind in patients that have febrile cytopenia mimicking lupus flares. This is a life-threatening hyperinflammatory syndrome. You can see it at the beginning or later in lupus. We use high-dose steroids, gamma globulin, and you have to use cytotoxic drugs. We rheumatologists use cyclophosphamide, and hematologists use etoposide. A few things about the pulmonary hypertension. It's a rare complication of lupus, but it's different than the pulmonary hypertension that you see in systemic sclerosis, because people are recognizing now that we have two different phenotypes. We have the vasculopathic in a patient with low lupus disease activity, and this resembles the pure pulmonary arterial hypertension, and you don't need immunosuppressive therapy, but also there is a vasculitic so-called in patients who have high lupus activity, and these patients, they may benefit from immunosuppressive therapy, and we have seen and have reported, and many people have reported that immunosuppressive therapy in such patients adds an extra benefit in addition to vasodilator therapy. Myocarditis is become increasingly being recognized because of the MRI and the antitroponin test. I don't know what really these MRI figures in a patient who don't have overt symptoms with lupus mean, but we just have to wait for some more data to help us. And finally, I would like to remind the younger people that in rare cases, animalarials can use cardiomyopathy and can be the hypertrophic restrictive with or without conduction abnormalities. Keep this in the back of your mind. Don't forget it, but don't think too much about it. Just if you cannot explain a heart problem in lupus patient, think of that as a possibility. In lupus nephritis, from all lupus patients, who are the 20% who will develop nephritis? especially younger people, people who have active serology anti-DNA-C3, and those people who have a SLEDAI more than 8. And how do you screen them? You do the SLEDAI, you do the urinalysis, and you do the kidney biopsy. And how often? It depends, every 3 to 12 months, depending on activity. The stronger predictors for end-stage renal disease are the extensive interstitial fibrosis, tubular atrophy, which is chronicity, and the crescents, and the activity index, which are and the risk factors for end-stage renal disease are shown here: male gender, hypertension, high activity chronicity index, and if you stop and do not use maintenance immunosuppressive therapy, increases the risk. Most of these data in recent years come from the wonderful group in Milan, and they have data which is almost 40 years old now, and they report that the end-stage renal disease-free survival rose from 80% to 90% at 20 years in Milan. That's a place to go if you have lupus nephritis. And they think that they attribute that to the fact that they do earlier diagnostic biopsies. This is a message to the rheumatologist in a patient with hematuria glomerular or little proteinuria, especially young patients with active disease. Do the kidney biopsy. You'll be surprised. Sometimes you might find things and you may save the patients from troubles. So if you like to have the Italian results, do the biopsies, low threshold for biopsies, and use potent immunosuppressive therapy. I'll get back to that. The metrology is important. It's a global disease. You don't have any idea what disease you have if you don't measure diseases in every single organ. That's important for the metrology in lupus. We use the SLEDAI DUK, and in this slide, I have some of the basic facts, and I hope that the organizers will make the slides available to them, to the attendants, so you can use it. I don't want to lose time. This helps you tremendously have a better feel how active is the disease. The SLEDAI flare index, after that you can see whether the patient has flare or not. And finally, the damage index, that is another validated index that allows to tell you how much damage the patient has accumulated, how good is your therapy, and that has also prognostic significance. Why metrology? Because if you follow the metrology, you're more effective in keeping low activity. Lower activity means less damage. Less damage means less morbidity and mortality. There are beautiful data supporting that over the last 20 years. There are global, based on these lupus activity measures, we use the SLEDAI, the BILAG, and the Selena SLEDAI for outcome measures. And because they have limitations in the, as you remember, with the belimumab trial, they use the SLE responder index, which uses the strengths and avoids the weaknesses of all three measures. And this has been we've been using that in global lupus trials. The clinical trials in lupus have been difficult because of the nature of the disease, because of the high background therapy, because of the mild diseases included in the trials, and did not allow for the drug to show what it can do. And everybody agrees that we need to have a better inclusion criteria, endpoints, and outcomes. I have been argued over the years that, based on my experience with lupus nephritis, that it's best to have organ-specific criteria. These global indices tell you something, but they may not mean much. So I will use them as a secondary criteria and use organ-specific criteria. I have been argued about this for over the years. A few things about the management of the lupus. In 2019, there was a need to update the criteria the European experts had developed. And in the management of lupus, these criteria, they are based on two pillars. First, you have to determine the severity of the disease, and how you do that when you take into consideration whether you have involvement of major organs or you have an organ-threatening disease, or if you have multiple concomitant activity from multiple secondary organs, that also can be severe disease, or if the patient needs high dose of steroids or immunosuppressive therapy to control the disease. That's the first period. You determine severity, and then your target is remission or low disease activity. And what changed in the new updated criteria? These are only guidance. They are not. This is not the law. These are suggestions. Treatment goals in treating lupus: you need to increase survival, prevent organ damage, optimize health-related quality of life. You target remission or low disease activity, and importantly, prevention of flares. Flare is an important outcome in lupus, not just the disease activity. All patients should take hydroxychloroquine, steroids minimized. You have to use immunosuppressive agents to minimize steroids and if you have major organ involvement. If you have persistently active or flaring disease with frequent flares, you may add belimumab, that's in the recommendations. You may use a rituximab or cyclophosphamide for organ-threatening refractory disease. And also, we have developed a specific recommendation now for cutaneous neuropsychiatric hematologic renal disease with specific algorithms for this, just to make things a little bit clear. And this is the figure from the publication. You can see here mild, moderate, severe disease, first-line therapy, and what you do in refractory, the drugs that you use, the adjunct therapy here into the right, and the target remission. This is how you define, or low disease activity, and this is how you define low disease activity. And as far as the algorithms, we give algorithms for class 4 lupus nephritis. You start with steroids with an MMF, or steroids with low dose IV cyclophosphamide, or the combination of them. And if you don't respond at 3 to 12 months, then switch to alternative therapy. Note that we have included calcineurin inhibitors now for the first time, the multi-targeted therapy. Whereas in severe disease, we go for MMF and cyclophosphamide or the multi-targeted therapy. And if you have relapsing disease, you switch to alternative induction therapy. You'll see these algorithms in the publications. And this is the algorithms for class 4 for membranous lupus nephritis. Pretty much you use MMF there, and then you use cyclophosphamide for severe disease. And we don't yet, the calcineurin inhibitors, we may use them, but not for a long period of time, then the nephrologists like them. For neuropsychiatric disease, this algorithm pretty much tells you that you have to distinguish if it's a thrombotic or inflammatory event, if it's attributed to lupus or not, and if it's inflammatory, using suppressive therapy. And for hematologic disease, for thrombocytopenia, we define the targets of therapy. First line therapy is steroids, and second, or for acute therapy, IV immunoglobulin, and the second line therapy then is rituximab, and the third line of treatment is TPO agonist or splenectomy. Be careful, the hematologist is very eager to use the TPO agonist. In lupus patients, they may cause thrombosis, especially in patients with anticardiolipin antibodies. Just be resistant to their recommendations, question them hard. Women's health and fertility issues are important in lupus, and I don't have the time to dwell to that, but I just would like to point out that low disease activity before and during pregnancy, if you use hydroxychloroquine, you have better pregnancy outcomes. The gynecologists, they are very anxious with the use of Plaquenil, and this is an ongoing battle with them to convince them to allow the patient to take the Plaquenil. And also, I would like to point out to a recent publication showing that in multi-center study from all over the world, in people who have a high risk for preeclampsia, that the low-dose aspirin is underused, and you know that can really decrease the risk for developing preeclampsia or eclampsia. And all these are summarized, the issues with lupus, fertility, are in this slide, and this is how you classify the high and the low risk. But I would like to leave you with this, is in contrast to what older generations were taught, don't become pregnant if you are a lupus patient. Now we encourage and we support patients who want to have a family, and there are ways to do that safely in spite of the problems. Survival and mortality is improving, but we're reaching a plateau, and that's a problem. There's a problem with poor countries. And also, I would like to show you in this line here, in young patients, lupus still has a high mortality, and this is a frontier in lupus. We have, for younger patients, we have to have more aggressive therapy, and we have not done as well as we could have done. And this, for the adult lupus patients, we're doing much better. Let me go into the last part, just to show you, to finish by telling you, highlighting a few recent clinical trials and what we have learned from them. And because, in my opinion, these are paving the way for the future, and I will finish with that. The calcineurin inhibitors have drawn increased attention because of studies from China show that if you add to MMF and steroids tacrolimus, you get more fast induction and better maintenance rates. When we examined these papers in the EULAR recommendations, we took a more cautious approach. We felt that we cannot generalize the use of the calcineurin inhibitors, but as you will see in the guidelines, we use them for patients who have more severe or refractory disease until we have more data. There is a new calcineurin inhibitor, voclosporin, which more likely will be approved for lupus use in lupus. Where that has high rates of adverse events. There was a death there, so we need to have more data before we generalize the use. You saw the BLISS study in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that you may add BLISS and improves rates of response. And let me finish with this, that the advances in lupus have led to new clinical trials, and now we're targeting antibodies with antibodies B and T cells, dendritic cells, interferon, cytokines. We use low-dose IL-2 to increase the Tregs to boost the regulatory T cell function. And also, the other important breakthrough is the initial studies with parisitinib, that another kinase inhibitors under development, and the low-dose IL-2, which dictate the cautious optimism. So this is what I had to tell you. I would like to thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I hope next time I will be with you physically.
Okay, thank you so much, Dimitris, for this wonderful